All right, great, thank you. Good introduction. The General Secretary comment, we were talking about the Soviet Union quite a bit, so it's a Communist Party reference for those who didn't find it hilarious. I did. That's one thing about jokes, is that I really don't care if anybody gets my jokes, as long as I'm entertained by them. That's what I'm here for. So hopefully if I make any, you'll find them funny. Great. I guess we shall begin here. I'm going to speak tonight, and I think before I do, this is the kickoff event for this club for the semester, or for the year. And I want to say just a little bit about the club, the organization. And the Classical Liberal Organization has kind of an interesting history, because it was originally founded at New York University, at NYU, when I was a PhD candidate there. And this founding was kind of interesting because NYU has 40,000 students about. And New York University, and two undergraduates said, we need a libertarian club here, so let's found one. And they were required to have 5 officers. They only knew of 2 libertarians out of 40,000 students that they could find. And so they went to Peter Boettke, who's a professor at NYU at the time, who they knew was sympathetic to these ideas, and they asked him what to do. And he called in all the grad students who were Austrian economics fellows and said, you guys sign up, you're now officers in this club. So I was a founding member of the NYU CLO. I was the secretary, general secretary, I guess. And then it was a very cool organization. And that was kind of our history, but it was a student-driven thing. We mostly just get together and have discussions. And because it was in NYU, you'd have very famous people coming through New York, and they would come and join us. We had a great time. It's pretty cool. If anybody ever is up in my office, the Ayn Rand sketch that I have on my wall was actually drawn by the founder of the first president of the club, Chris Whitten. Anyway, so I, years later, ended up at Hillsdale, and we did have a group here called the Classical Liberals, and it was not very well organized. It fell apart after about the year after I got here, I think. And so for a few years, there was no organization like this. I was talking to some students, and they said, we need some sort of a classical liberal presence. And so they founded this, and they said, what are we going to call it? And I said, we'll just call it CLO, after what we had at NYU, and make it similar. Because their idea was to have something that was completely student-driven, and they were going to be able to have discussions, and people do presentations and things like that. So that's really what this club is supposed to be about. Like Praxis, the economics club, tends to bring in a lot of pretty well-known speakers, and they give lectures. This usually is supposed to be student-driven. If anybody has a presentation they want to give, this is the vehicle to do it, and then freewheeling discussions about it. And we've had some very cool ones in the past. So sort of that's what I'll do tonight. It's kind of a presentation and a lecture as a kickoff. But this is not something where it's just Q&A and you ask. I mean, we have audience members that debate. We had one time where a guy got up and did a horrible presentation. He had a packed room. His presentation lasted 5 minutes. And is that it? So the audience just started debating each other. And it was a fabulous thing. So that works. Sometimes it's unwieldy, but so what? The other thing I'll say about this group is that when we had the COVID shutdown in the spring, as far as I know, this is the only student organization that kept going. And we had several events that we put on Zoom, and they were discussions of the economics of the shutdown and things. Those are, I think, still available on YouTube. And we're recording this one, and so we'll try to make that available at some point too. So anyway, I'm going to get going here with all that prologue. But before I do, I have a question. Who owns you?
Who what?
Who owns you?
Who owns me?
Who's your owner? Who's your owner?
Jesus.
Okay, he's got an answer at least. You're just sitting there like, I don't know. Check the title deed. Who owns you? You're in the back smiling. You're trying to look behind like somebody else. I don't know your name, but who owns you? Just give me an answer. Myself. Yourself, okay. This is a weird question, right? It's maybe a weird question to some, but for someone who is a classical liberal or a libertarian, it's not a weird question. Who owns you? There is such a thing as, unfortunately, people being owned. This is not a strange question, though, for a libertarian or a classical liberal. The answer that would immediately come to mind is, nobody owns me, or I own myself, or God owns me, but no man owns me. That's the libertarian or classical liberal answer. That's not a weird question for us. And in fact, it's a starting point for these sets of ideas. So I want to talk about that a little bit. I don't know if any of you have ever met a chattel slave, a person who is owned, because I have, and I met his owner. And this was in West Africa. I mean, this stuff really goes on. It was interesting, but at any rate, it was not quite like that, but at any rate. So let me just talk a little bit about some of the philosophical background and kind of the ideas here. The principle of self-ownership is that you own yourself. And this is a starting, I would say, an axiom for this, for our line of political thought. That's, of course, John Locke, and I think everyone here from Hillsdale has some familiarity with John Locke. And he, in his two treatises on government, kind of lays out a case for this. Adam Smith put it a little bit, well, really the same, I guess. And he says, each of us has been entrusted to our own care. That's our nature. We are entrusted to take care of ourselves. We're the ones in charge. As a person, you control yourself. You have an interest in yourself. This is part of the reason Smith comes up with this notion of self-interest. You have an interest in yourself, and you have responsibility for yourself. Self-interest is not a bad thing, because how else are you going to take care of yourself? This is part of Smith's argument. If you go back farther than that, you can think of Aristotle, for example. Aristotle argues that we are to each conduct ourselves according to our nature. And we should learn what our nature is so that we can do so well and so that we can flourish. The idea is kind of embedded in Hillsdale. Hillsdale College is about trying to build individual character, build the individual, the character, the knowledge, and things to live a good life. This actually is what the principle of individualism is about. And so we start with that. Well, there are various corollaries that follow from this idea of self-ownership. Okay, you can kind of make him out. There's Benjamin Franklin. I liked that one because it's got supposedly his bifocals or whatever he invented. And one of the things he argues is that self-ownership has to include freedom to think for yourself. If you didn't have that, self-ownership would be completely meaningless. If people could just tell you, you own yourself, but you have to do whatever, believe what I say, do what I say, that's meaningless self-ownership. And so this quote from Franklin. Franklin suggests, without this, we can't even have wisdom. There's no way to test whether some statement or some assertion is true or not, unless we can test it. And how do you test it? Well, a prerequisite for that is that you're free to think about it. That's a prerequisite, this freedom of thought. Because the way of testing for truth is through reason, broadly understood. It could be pure logic. It could be empirical testing, experiments, whatever it is, depending on the context, it's appropriate. But you need freedom of thought to do that, to consider different ideas. Okay? Freedom of speech. Well, if you have freedom of thought, but you then can't express what you've been thinking about, you can't manifest it in the real world. And so freedom of thought also follows from this fundamental principle of self-ownership. Now, that also would entail freedom to act on the things that you've discovered or that you believe. There are some limits to that. The limits are everybody else also has the same rights. And so this notion of individual rights that I'm kind of quickly developing here means that there's a freedom to act restricted by others' co-equal rights. And I say co-equal, it's redundant. I've seen this word used, but it's good to make it redundant. My rights are equal to yours, yours are equal to mine, and they're the same rights to our own property and ourselves. Okay? Those are the limits. And so rights become both freedoms from one perspective, but they are also limits to what we can do. And both of those aspects are, of course, crucial. Okay, great. Remember to hit enter. And that's really hard to see that picture, but that's William Penn back there. And the quotes I think are easy to read, but he's talking about property rights. I think Penn is underappreciated on this, but Penn wrote some very explicit statements about the importance of private property as an extension of this. And private property, one's just earnings, the things that you justly own, that could come through homesteading, kind of an idea. It could come through exchange, voluntary exchange. It could come through gifts, where people give you something. But justly acquired property is a part of this. Without material things, human life is not possible. So this is also a fundamental kind of a thing that is important. Great, well, there's then a subsequent corollary to that, and that we would say is the free market. And the free market idea is that if you have a right to property, you have a right to dispose of it, including making deals with other people, exchanging property. That's going to be fundamental, of course, to have any kind of an economy that's at all complex. So you may exchange your property, including your labor, for something else voluntarily. So freedom of contract is quite important. Freedom of exchange. And contract includes some very complex contracts. It could include something like forming a corporation, or it could be forward contracts or options or something like this. And this, what I've laid out is really, you think of it as a moral principle. It also has some support from the discipline of economics. And of course, I'm an economist. Well, in economics, we are tackling the market from a little bit different direction rather than a moral question, but rather how effective is it? And it turns out that I think we can say pretty safely that there are very positive consequences of the free market for human prosperity. That's actually kind of nice, because suppose that on the one hand we said the moral thing was this, but the thing that gives us prosperity is that. Suppose there had to be a trade-off between freedom and material well-being, then that would be a headache. But in fact, the two things align nicely. They both are fostered by the free market. And just so you know that that's not just obvious, Paul Samuelson, famous Nobel Prize winning economist, at one point said that there's a difficult problem for Americans. We have more freedom, but the Soviets have a better economy. The superior functioning of a centrally planned economy requires there's a trade-off between freedom and prosperity, is what Samuelson said. Turns out he was wrong. Good. Comrades. And we're down here pretending to be, maybe we're pretending. Anyway, Soviets. All right, where were we? Stop. I don't want to get carried away on that. Anyway, so what do we call this? All this philosophy that I've been talking about. And the name is liberalism, and liberalism is Ludwig von Mises, if you can read the fine print, in Human Action. He says liberalism is a political doctrine. Bettina Ben-Greaves, who wrote a preface to one of his books, said the free market economy, limited government, and individual freedom, that's what makes up what we call liberalism. Okay. Oh wait, I was calling it libertarianism, now I'm calling it liberalism. Are those the same thing, or are they different? And of course, it depends on the context of when you're using the word liberalism, but in the liberalism, in the classical sense, is what Ludwig von Mises talked about. Okay, this is Mises, the great Austrian economist. And the other one is Leonard E. Read, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, free market organization. And Mises at some point argues, he says, in a number of points, says, progressives have stolen our name, our name liberal, and they've attached it to their welfare state socialism. And they call themselves liberals now, kind of as a propaganda coup. He and Hayek write letters back and forth about this. I was talking to one of my former students who was doing work in the archives here, and they found one of Mises' letters, where an exchange of letters between Mises and Hayek, where they're saying, what are we going to do about the way language has been polluted? And the term liberalism has been corrupted to mean progressive socialists. Well, Leonard E. Read said, the current term that now we adopt is libertarianism. Now, some people will make a distinction between classical liberalism and libertarianism. Okay, and they'll start doing fine dicing and sorts of things. I don't. I am calling this talk classical libertarianism. That's sort of a play on all this. And that's simply because I want to distinguish myself from, there are some contemporary libertarians who say some things that I think get a little out of hand. And I think some of them are trying to ingratiate themselves with the left. And I'm not going to get into that today unless people wanted to discuss it. But I don't want to be misunderstood that I'm as to where I stand or something. And some libertarians will also assume, I get the idea that some of them think that libertarianism is simply being against the government, anti-government. And I think 90% of the time, libertarianism is about being against the government. But that's not the fundamental point. The fundamental point is being for individual rights. That's the fundamental principle. And the reason you would think that the government is a problem is simply that it is because it gets out of hand so often. It's not properly restrained. So, at any rate. Uh-oh, I think I was going to edit these. All right, there's one snowman engaging in unjustified coercion against another. This is actually not part of my talk, but it's a cool slide, isn't it? And I was going to take it out. It got in by accident, but that could be the highlight. Who knows? All right, let's move on. So let me talk just a little bit about what all of this implies, and maybe this is obvious, and especially to an audience here, but this is, of course, from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Men are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. It's our natural right, is what we're talking about. These things are inherent in us. So that's the principle. It was part of the American founding. They took it from the people been talking about. Governments are, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So government has a purpose, and that's to protect our rights. That's why we have it. It is, we create governments to protect our rights. That's the purpose. Government is a means, whereas individuals and their flourishing, that's the end. We're trying to have better lives. That's a tool, one of the tools we can use to help protect ourselves. It's not vice versa. It's not that the government is the end and we are the means to this greater glory. Now, I say all this, and of course everybody agrees with it, right? Caleb finds that amusing. Well, of course they do. In fact, Alfredo Rocco points out, for liberalism, society has no life distinct from the life of the individual. For liberalism, the individual is the end and society the means. Do you know Alfredo Rocco? Oh, does anyone know who Alfredo Rocco was? Oh, for shame. Everyone should know Alfredo Rocco. He was Benito Mussolini's Minister of Justice in fascist Italy. And he continues. He's criticizing, but I think he has much of what he says. Oh, there it is, yeah. For fascism, society is the end and individuals are the means. This is not an uncommon idea. Okay? Maybe you are supposed to be, maybe you're here for the higher purposes of someone else or society or something like this. And so he lays this out. He goes farther with this argument, and he says, fascism faces squarely the problem of the right of the state and the duty of the individuals. Individual rights, and you can read the rest of it, but what is he talking about here? He's suggesting, well, here's what he's talking about. Let me go to the next one. Am I in the right place? Oh, no, wait. They don't like each other, apparently. That is the slide I was looking for. This once in a while happens. I get lost, but as long as the audience is with what's going on, that's all we care about. Individual rights are recognized. The state has unalienable rights, is what his idea is in fascist thought. Individual rights are merely entitlements that are granted by government. And that's a remarkably common idea. I have quotes from a different talk I gave where Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, makes very similar statements. And it's kind of alarming to think that we would have this kind of a notion saying, well, you know, the Declaration of Independence has it backwards. The state is superior to you. Sorry, the individual, but it is you. It's not an uncommon idea in progressive thought, for example. Great. Now, not everyone disagrees. Stalin is kind of on this line. What's the idea of the the Marxist position? So this comes from a book by Stalin, and prior to this quote, he's quoting Marx. Karl Marx is very clear that the dictatorship of the proletariat is necessary to bring people to the correct ideas. The people, we have to govern, the people need to rule, but first they have to have the correct ideas, and the dictatorship will give it to them. Lenin and Stalin, for Marx, that's just a theory. I mean, it's, he's an armchair academic spinning all this stuff. But for Lenin and Stalin, this is actually running the Soviet Union. This is a practical problem. What are they going to do? And Lenin writes about it, and Stalin is quoting him and advancing on this. The proletarians must govern, but first they have to become correct proletarians because they don't get it. Not completely. They haven't gone far enough. We'll have to teach them how to govern in their own interest. They have to be compelled to think. They think wrong. They have to be compelled to think correctly. Karl Marx raises this, kind of invents this whole thing, but he has this notion that is called polylogism, that different classes have different manners of thought, different logics. And so that's convenient for him because he's been attacked by bourgeois economists, by classical economists who say Marxism is wrong. If he can say that their logic is wrong, he doesn't have to address their arguments. He can say that's just bourgeois apologetics, and we have a different, better way of thinking. Great, okay. Now we just have to make sure the proletarians actually understand proletarian logic, more or less. They have to be forced to think right. And this is the problem that Stalin is talking about. Okay. All right, great. All right, that's kind of the, I guess, a prologue on the, not prologue, that's the introduction, kind of the philosophy of these ideas. Let me say just a little bit about policy implications. And there are many things I'm going to talk about now that would make extremely cool discussion topics, presentations or something, and I'm just going to touch on a few of them and not go into any depth. But one of the first things that's implied for what we can say from these principles is that there are limits to the proper use of force and limits to the proper use of government. If you're going to initiate force, if you're going to start force, if you're going to fight someone, attack someone, threaten someone, there are only certain circumstances under which that's appropriate. And what are those circumstances? Well, obviously, if you followed this, for the libertarian or classical liberal, it's defensive. It's only to protect rights. That's when force is allowed. Otherwise, it would be violating someone else's rights. Okay, great. And that means that the proper functions of government would be, government is force, it's organized by people, and so it's supposed to provide that kind of protection. So the proper role of government would be police, courts, law, military. That's it. I started to go on and on and on because I just barely scratched the surface of what government does today, but that's the other 90%. Okay, great. There are actually some libertarians, I should mention, that think we could dispense with government. The market itself could handle this. We could do it on the market. Anarcho-capitalists, Murray Rothbard, for example, David Friedman, Milton Friedman's son, made those arguments. And that's an interesting thing. It's a fun, interesting debate. I'm not going to talk about it now, but it's another, that's minimal government, zero government, just have the market take care of it. Another point is this distinction between vice and crime. I think it was Lysander Spooner, who was a 19th century anarcho-capitalist, who framed it that way. But the distinction between there are things which are immoral and they are criminal. And there are things which are immoral and not criminal. And there's a distinction between the two. And one of those is a police matter and one is not. And so there's a limit. And the limit is, does it violate is one person violating another's rights or not? If so, it's a police matter, and if not, it's not. So think of something that is terribly immoral. Think of what would fall under vice. And one of my favorite examples, supposing, heaven forbid, that I worship in the wrong way, that someone else thinks is the wrong way. Actually, that could be a really serious, bad thing. But it's not a police matter. Okay? It's one's own choice. And one is entitled to make one's mistakes. Okay? On the other hand, suppose that I am committing a crime or attacking someone. That's a police matter. Totally different thing. An application of this which is highly controversial for libertarians is, what about the use of drugs? I will tell you that I think that the use of recreational drugs, generally speaking, is extremely self-destructive and dangerous and often suicidal. Depends what it is, but it's not a good thing, and it should not be illegal. I've had that discussion had it fairly recently with some couple of women who were conservative Republicans who were saying, it was at the Republican Party meeting, is why I mentioned Republicans, and they were saying, these ideas are great, but wow, geez, drugs, that's that's a bridge too far or something. And they were asking me about it, and I said, look, many of the things that you are complaining about or say that you're fearful with drugs are actually consequences of not making people be responsible for their behavior if they take drugs, and letting them get away with a number of different things. And we discussed that a while, and they said, it's starting to sound more reasonable to us. Well, it may not be completely convincing to people, but I'm not sure why people in Washington, D.C. should be telling any of us what we may and may not consume. Okay? It may be a bad decision, but I don't think that the government should have the right to tell, or the power to tell us. Government doesn't have rights. Anyway, the difference here is that criminal acts violate rights, and anything else that doesn't may be good or bad, but it isn't the responsibility of the state to handle it. Great. What else? Free market and regulation, and not surprisingly, I think I've made it clear, but private property and the freedom to exchange, to produce and exchange are fundamental if you're going to have any kind of an advanced society. It won't function on the basis of central planning. That's in economics class. We won't talk about it now. But it's fundamental to human civilization. I really think that one of the greatest threats we face comes from the administrative state in the United States today. The administrative state, which expands its control over almost all aspects of the economy. With some things, when you ask somebody, oh, cool, how do you start that business? When you find out what's actually entailed in the regulation, you want to make bear spray? Bear spray, like spraying grizzly bears, self-defense, hot pepper spray. I was talking to a guy who makes this, and after he had his company set up, and it's all set, he had his product, he has to go through all the EPA, and he has to go through EPA clearance and all this sort of thing. And he got all his permissions. FDA, I think, also has to cover it, and gets all the clearances. He's all set to go, and then he put a Bible verse on his bear spray label. And he got fined thousands of dollars by EPA for violating federal regulations because it hadn't yet been approved by the federal government. So you have to have your Bible verses on your bear spray. You didn't know that regulation, did you? Like, who did? The regulations that you hear about are just astonishing. It's not, somebody wrote a book on this. It's not, they're called 5 felonies a day. The average person who is living a normal life in the United States commits 5 felonies a day inadvertently by violating federal regulations. So this is a pretty serious one. What else? Oh, I'm getting carried away with that one. Taxation. And of course, if you're going to have government, you'll have some taxation. The purpose is for revenue. It's not for social engineering. It's not to tax people so they will smoke less or so that they will do this or do that. It's to tax people purely for revenue. And therefore, taxes should be light. They should not be heavy because we don't need a huge government. And they should do as little harm as possible. And your tax revenue, while we're at it, ought to define your budget rather than borrowing like crazy. But those sorts of things. Foreign policy, this is another one where there will be controversy, and especially even amongst libertarians. So the purpose of government is self-defense. That's it. So defending us against foreign aggression would mean defending us. How best to do that? Well, one thing that libertarians agree on is non-intervention. Other countries' internal private matters are none of our government's business. They might be good, bad, or indifferent, but it's not for the United States government or any government to try to govern other countries. Essentially, what you want is good commercial relations and no tight alliances that get you into other people's wars and things like that. What else they say? Anyway, good. All right, maybe I'll say a little bit about controversies, because if nothing else, it's a cute slide. I thought it was cute. There's a guy and a bicycle. Why do libertarians, classical liberals, sometimes disagree wildly on policy? And we can get pretty argumentative with each other. And I think it's because we have common principles. Why would we argue? Well, because to implement principles requires more than just the principles. It also requires theories. What are theories? Those are stories about how does the world work? What are the cause and effect relations? So if you're thinking, if you're thinking in economics, economics is pretty well established. Everybody who knows anything about this is going to think, yeah, you put on a price control, you're going to have a price ceiling or you're going to have economic dislocations. It's going to push your economy out of equilibrium and cause shortages or surpluses. That's not much debate on that. But what about other sciences, social sciences, like geopolitics or military strategy? If you do this, what's the response going to be in this part of the world? Okay, and it might be important to think about that. But what are the cause and effect relations in geopolitics? Wow, has anybody ever figured that out? I think I have. No, nobody has. I don't think. Yeah, well, we all think we have probably. We all know everything. There's another issue. What are the facts? What are the facts of the matter in a given case? So I put that thing up because suppose you witness the following thing. You're watching and you see somebody riding down the street on a bicycle. This guy's riding along. Suddenly somebody else jumps out of the bushes, hits the guy on the bike with a stick, falls off, runs over, kicks him, grabs the bike, jumps on it, rides off. What did you just see?
Assault.
What?
Assault.
He just saw an assault. Anyone else?
Depends on whose bike it is.
It depends on whose bike it is. Okay, what you just saw was a guy jump out of the bushes, whack somebody with a stick, kick him, jump on the bike and ride off. If it was if the bike belonged to the guy riding the bike, you just saw a robbery, an assault. If it was what if it was a guy retrieving his stolen bike from the robber? Maybe you just saw, oh great, libertarian in action, I don't know, something like that. I actually when I was setting this up, I actually came across a true story of a gal in Canada whose $1,000 bike was stolen. And the next morning, she was really upset, and her friend called her, and I just saw it on Craigslist. So she called the thief, and he said, yeah, he was selling it. She said, oh, I'd like to buy it. And so they met in the McDonald's parking lot. She said, can I give it a test ride? He said, sure. And she rode off. And so anyway, okay, but here's another example of this kind of thing, is imagine remember the invasion of Iraq by President Bush 43, George W. Bush. When that happened, I was against it. There was the whole run up to it. I said I'm against it. I was against it from the start. I thought it was a bad idea. I still think so. And his argument basically, at least at the start, was the Iraqis are developing nuclear weapons or some kind of a weapon of mass destruction that they're going to use against us. And I said, I don't believe it. I don't think they are. I think Mohammed al-Baradei and the other guy are probably right when they say that they don't have this weapons program. If I were wrong, I would have had a very different, if they got in there and they said, hey, well, they got a half-finished nuclear weapon and plans to use it on the United States, that fact would change everything in my perception. I would think, yeah, it's a good idea to go there. So disagreement over you can have the same principles, but different facts will lead you to a different understanding of what the proper policy is. And in foreign policy especially, this is why I think there's so much controversy or disagreement on specific issues among libertarians. So anyway, well, enough about that. And I should ask, questions? I just love talking, unfortunately for you. Yeah, Ben.
From a bit ago, but given that Mises thought there's no such thing as like a perfect government was basically impossible because it's an organization of coercion. It's supposed to prevent coercion, but it itself is an organization of coercion. Like, what principle are we using to reconcile the trade-off between complete self-ownership and a liberal society with limited government? And so basically my question here is like, is Samuelson right? Is there a trade-off between complete self-ownership and a free liberal society that has limited government?
Why do you not why do you not have complete self-ownership?
Well, one, there has to be taxation.
Taxation.
Is without my consent. Two, there's always somebody who is the ultimate decision maker who lies above me
Okay.
to make decisions.
So this is a very Murray Rothbardian kind of point. I will simply, for right now, I'll just say that at least in principle, the way that taxes are done, you are committing to your own, it's spent for your own defense. It's the public good argument, which Rothbard rejects, the public good argument. So you're actually, it doesn't violate your self-ownership, it's protected it. Yeah. I'm just going to say it really fast on that.
Okay. Can I respond?
Yeah.
Okay. So.
Are you? I always go ahead. He's in all my classes, and I always point him out as being the anarchist. Whether he is or not, I don't know.
So I guess using the compensation principle argument, how can you ever know that I'm like fully ever compensated completely?
Oh, you can't.
Yeah. So then how do you like basically use that as a workable principle? And
You have Mises' whole point is that this has been imperfectly implemented. I mean that there's no such thing as perfectly implementing this completely. Okay. It's an ideal that you approach. I will say that I looked at my watch to see what day, whether it's an even or odd numbered day, because I always tell people on odd numbered days I'm a minimal state guy, but on even numbered days I'm an anarchist, because that's kind of the balance that I like to strike there. At any rate, should we talk about threats to, anyway, let's move on for a minute and then come back to all that. I want to talk just a little bit now, this is kind of a shift of gears, but what are some of the new threats, sort of, I guess we can say new threats, to liberty? And I want to talk about 3 of them. And I suspect everyone here is pretty pro-liberty in one sense or another. But I've got the woke left, new conservatism, and the Great Reset. I will say a little bit about each one. And the first, this whole idea of woke, which is a strange term, but culture, everyone's familiar with all this laundry list of stuff. Cancel culture, and I want to emphasize cultural Marxism. And really, I think this new left that we see today is an extension, it's a pretty good extension, I say good, it's a pretty accurate extension of ideas that are within Marx. Karl Marx critiques all of bourgeois capitalist culture. He attacks everything in it. It's not just economics. He says that the structure of the family is all wrong, the bourgeois family, the relations with the sexes, everything is wrong. But he puts all of his eggs in one basket. And he says that the revolution will be fought over these economic principles, and it will be over exploitation of labor, theory of surplus value. That will drive the proletariat to overthrow the capitalists. And so he emphasizes the economics rather than the other things. And then something happens, and that's that the revolution doesn't really occur. There's a failure of the proletarians to sufficiently revolt. And other Marxist theorists start saying, we have to rethink this a little bit. One of them is an Italian, Antonio Gramsci. And Gramsci contemplates this, and he says, you know why the workers, the proletariat, aren't rebelling? It's because they have been brainwashed. It's culture. They are culturally oppressed. They have adopted the bourgeois culture and mindset. And there's where the problem is. The battle must be fought on cultural grounds. And another group, the Frankfurt School, that emanates from Germany, ends up emigrating to the United States, developed something called critical theory. Critical theory comes from Marx. Marx says we need to do ruthless criticism of everything existing. Everything in existence must be criticized. That's how we will develop our new consciousness. And critical theory is about tearing everything to shreds. And it comes out of people like Marcuse, Herbert Marcuse, who I'll talk about here in a second. Great, new consciousness comes from. And then there's postmodernism. This is just, it's interesting, I guess we would say, because the argument here, it's hard to know whether the people who develop these ideas take them seriously. But postmodernism is the idea that, I think in a nutshell, language is fundamentally about statements about language. And that's it. You're talking about language, statements about statements. It's not about objective reality, which might not even be in existence. And language is fundamentally a tool by which oppressors oppress the oppressed. Society is nothing but a bunch of power relationships. There are oppressors and there's the oppressed, and that's it. And that's what language is all about. That's what argumentation is about, oppression. Okay. Interesting. So I'll return to all this a little bit here, but there's Herbert Marcuse. And there's a statement of his that comes from a paper of his, Repressive Toleration. And he was one of the members of the Frankfurt School. He was, I think, at Columbia University and then at Brandeis when they fled from fleeing the Nazis, coming over to the United States. But he argued that our bourgeois free speech is actually a tool of oppression. Free speech is a tool of oppression. And if you want to have true free speech or true freedom, it requires us to silence those who have power. That's what he says here. Movements from the right liberating tolerance, that's real tolerance that makes us free, would mean that we have to shut up the people on the right. That is, we have to shut up. The cancel culture is born in this kind of a doctrine. And true freedom requires silencing those with power in favor of those who favor the revolution, whatever it might be, which is going to be all this multicultural, all the stuff that was up there before. And the goal of this cancel culture really is to intimidate and silence opposition. It's to control people and to establish a new set of power relations. That's what's going on today at most universities. You're probably aware of that sort of thing, but and not just, it's moved outside of universities. All right, well, let's continue with this cheerful stuff. Well, who could ever dispute Black Lives Matter? Ann Wortham actually disputes Black Lives Matter. The founders of this organization, Black Lives Matter, pretty famous now, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, Alicia Garza. When this group was first announced, I actually did something really weird. I actually looked them up. Hardly anybody ever does this, but I actually looked up who they were, and I thought, oh, look, they're all Marxists. They're all Marxists, and now they openly say they are Marxists. Black Lives Matter, for some time, has been associated with the Revolutionary Communist Party. You guys know the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP. That's the group that broke with the CPUSA, Communist Party USA, which CPUSA was the original Communist Party in the United States. They were the ones that were allied with the Soviet Union and this sort of thing. And at some point, CPUSA said, we have decided we forswear violent revolution. And so the RCP broke with them. I used to go to their headquarters in New York and talk to them. They had a cool bookstore. But they're, yeah, we're here for violent revolution. That's what we stand for. Those are the people who hang out with these guys. They show up at many of their rallies, and they're connected. Okay, well, so the group itself is not so, it might be objectionable, but certainly the sentiment. Well, maybe not the sentiment. What is the sentiment? It's black. They say Black Lives Matter. They don't say Blacks Lives Matter. There's a distinction, and they picked it out for a reason. Black is an adjective. Blacks Lives Matter would be a plural possessive. The lives of black people matter. But they're saying black lives. And what are black lives? In their literature, they have said that black, yes, it's a race, but it's a political identity. The political identity is this anti-capitalist stuff that they promote. And people like Walter Williams, Thomas Sowell, Clarence Thomas, Ann Wortham, they aren't black by that definition. And this is not what they're talking about. And their goal, of course, is to instill guilt, intimidate, and silence opposition. They're seeking to control others. So that's our new left, I guess we call it. That's scary. All right, let's move to something else. Oh no. Oh good, because we're at Hillsdale, now we can have some real controversy because there are probably some new conservatives around. New conservatives, who are they? Orrin Cass, for example. He's the founder of I guess a think tank policy institute called the American Compass. And one of his members is David Azarad. And another person who I think falls into this category is Michael Anton. Azarad and Anton are both at the Kirby Center, of course. They're colleagues, I guess, in a sense. Well, I have to criticize some of what they stand for. And some of the things they have stood for and been very clear about is industrial policy. What's industrial policy? Well, that is central planning light. But the government would direct the economy and to a certain extent and pick winners. You know, what industries, what firms are going to be benefited here. They have a very clear opposition to free trade. Not to all trade, but to free trade. And one of the things that Cass suggests, one of the people Cass suggests is Friedrich List, who has had no traction in economics, but he was an 1800s German writer who opposed the free trade, and was actually, strangely enough, kind of a founder in a roundabout way of the German Historical School, or an inspiration for the German Historical School, who I'm sure they don't like. So one of the things that bothers me about them is that their opposition to free trade and they see it as conflict. And they argue that economists who argue differently are engaging in what they call free trade or free market fundamentalism or free market dogma. And I think when they use that language, to me, is a sign that they don't have an argument. That's the kind of thing that kind of a label, if you say it's just dogma or it's just fundamentalism, is what you say when you don't really have an argument. I think it's kind of a refuge. I think they're being a little bit like Marx, where they sidestep the issues rather than engaging them, and I don't think they understand it. And I have to say, I appreciate many of their defenses of national sovereignty against global government and things like that. But industrial policy, that is empowering the administrative state to oversee the market. This is not what these guys, I think, even want, if they would understand what they're promoting. Putting bureaucrats in charge of the economy is fundamentally what industrial policy is. And I can't see how that fits with their opposition to the administrative state. So, good. In researching this, I came across a piece on the American Compass, and I just about got sick. I just had a fit. I don't think I've ever read anything that I thought, wow, you just didn't understand anything you read, did you? But this guy, Julius Krein, he might be a very nice guy and might have many fine principles. He has absolutely no understanding of what Hayek said Hayek had a paper, Use of Knowledge in Society, great paper, and he attacks it and says that Hayek was just nuts. This is a sample of what he says, but if I'm speaking to economists, Hillsdale economists, you'll know what I'm talking about, but I can't assume this. Hayek has made this argument that prices are crucial communicators of information used by entrepreneurs to understand what's in demand and what's not, and to understand whether what I'm producing, the cost, is worth the benefit. I want to make stuff where the benefit is greater than the cost. If the cost is greater than the benefit, then I've wasted things. Okay, that's what prices communicate. Central planners can't handle that. They can't identify things like that. He says, this is all just, he calls it anti-Soviet propaganda. Hayek's piece had nothing really to do with the Soviet Union. He was addressing mainstream economists who were saying that the United States could have central planning. It would work just fine. We're smart enough to do it. And Hayek is saying, no, you're not. And he gives some very nice examples of this. Hayek does. But I guess the bottom line, I'll really start ranting. And I know that the chief ranter back there, Dr. Pongrasic, would be, you'd be a great critic. I'd hope you hope a 9 or a 10, but I know, that's what I'm afraid of. I know, anyway, that's why I don't want to rant here. But let's put it this way. There's no way to identify economic benefits and costs except by profit and loss, as shown through prices that are generated by people's decisions and behavior, and the wise, rational government bureaucrat that is going to substitute for that does not exist. You can't do it. All right, good. That's enough about them. I don't want to rag on them too much. Michael Anton was just threatened with death by someone at a left-wing institute over Twitter. Fight back Hillsdale or something, I don't know. Anyway, oh good. Well, if you guys are not scared by the threats to liberty yet, this is the one that I think scares me the most, maybe. But I don't know if you know who this is. That's Klaus Schwab. He's from Germany, but he's a Swiss professor. And he's the founder of the World Economic Forum. And the World Economic Forum has the annual Davos meeting, Davos, Switzerland, where all the bigwigs in the world gather. And so the World Economic Forum is Schwab, George Soros and Bill Gates and people like this show up there. Christine Lagarde, who used to be head of the IMF, now she's head of the European Central Bank. Al Gore, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank. China and many other governments are members of this. Various world leaders, many international corporations, and they've got a new idea. And it is called the Great Reset. And this is what he says about it. But the Great Reset is this. The COVID-19 economic debacle, the shutdowns, have created a great opportunity. They say the world is under great threat from climate change and all these things, but we have a fabulous opportunity. We just turned off all the economies around the world. When we flip them back on, this is our chance to do it on a totally new basis and restructure the world, redraw and reimagine the world economy. Okay? It's not just the economy though. It turns out it's the political systems and the social and cultural systems. And they refer to the importance of developing a new social, they actually said contract, somehow I wrote compact. But these are the four building blocks in some of their literature that they talk about. Mindset is the first one. Mindset is, they say that we all need new thinking and new values. It's time to reject, and people they say we should reject, they said it's just a handful of thinkers. There's the dark vision of people like Adam Smith and Milton Friedman. We could instead adopt the bright view of Thomas Piketty, you probably call him, who wrote Capitalism or Capitalism for the 21st Century and Capitalism and Ideology. Capital for the 21st Century, Capitalism and Ideology, French socialist. That's the new vision. Wait a minute, isn't that what Stalin said? We need a new mindset for everyone? Metrics, we need new measures. It's not going to be market prices and GDP anymore. Well, we don't get rid of them, but we have to add to them environmental, ESG, environmental, social, and governance metrics. So if profit maximization and following the market isn't right, we need to instead shape things differently here. We will use these green accounting and things like that we've developed, or that we're developing. Actually, the attack on GDP is explicitly what some of the new conservatives have said. We're following prices too much. We need to administer differently. So there are some commonalities in this. Although I know that these guys and the new conservatives don't get along because they disagree over state sovereignty, for example, government, national sovereignty. Incentives. Well, how do you get this? We've got all the money. We need to pay, we need to incentivize the system. We're going to subsidize it. Or somebody's going to subsidize it when we set these new things up. And then connection. This one is so vague, but they say we need real connection to people. And it's unclear what that means. There's another one of their papers or whatever, the position pieces, whatever they call it, calls for the three components for a new capitalism. One of them is that, well, we need to redirect the market, and to redirect the market, governments will have to coordinate around the world. Okay, what does that mean? They will coordinate to develop a common strategy concerning taxes, regulations, fiscal policy, international trade, wealth taxes, and redistribution. And they name, for example, China and China and the United States as examples of countries that really have to be brought into this because they're so important. Great. I guess I won't say anything about it, but investment in sustainability, green infrastructure. We need to abandon fossil fuels. We have to promote some of the things they talk about are Black Lives Matter style racial justice. They're completely on board with that. They've got pages on this. And the other kinds of social justice, intersectional concerns. And then the other thing that they say is a crucial component is the fourth industrial revolution. Klaus Schwab has just published, actually I don't know if it's out, but he has a book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution. And this is the digitalization of everything and the development of artificial intelligence, which they say is the new industrial revolution. And they think that that really needs to be harnessed to help drive this and used properly. And so they're talking about a digital world of health and a digital world of finance, which Christine Lagarde has argued we need to have digital currency. Now, it can't be Bitcoin because she says this, Bitcoin is private, and so that won't work because we need the right kind of regulation for it. So central banks around the world should begin developing ideas to issue digital currency, because that way they can control it, and that'll be useful for monetary policy and also for controlling finance and how it's spent and things like that, which is true. It would be a great monitoring tool for that. Another one they promote is digital biometric identification for everybody. And now I get what the real connectivity that they're talking about is. There is actually a pilot project to try to develop ideas to have complete digital biometric IDs for every single person in Africa as a start. If they would like to, and the argument is that, well, people in Africa in particular don't have good IDs, don't have IDs. And this would be very important because if you use digital currency, you have to know who you're trading with, and this will permit that to work really well. But it's also an extremely powerful tool of control because it would be in the hands of central banks. And then culture and entertainment and things, it's just, to me, if this really came about, it sounds like a true nightmare. There isn't a word in any of their stuff that I've written, or that I've written. I didn't do it. There is not a word in any of their stuff I read that mentions freedom or that mentions that the people would, I mean, you wouldn't expect the people to ever to vote on something like this or get to decide, would you? There's no mention of it, at least. Nothing about those sorts of ideas. At any rate, well, I'll wrap up here. Oh my gosh, this is like been way too long. I thought this would be 30 minutes, but I told you I like to talk. You're out of luck. Well, this is what these people seem to have, and all of these things have in common, which is they have some suspicions that freedom actually works. They're skeptical of it, and I don't know. To me, the Great Reset in particular is an example of that, because there's not a single mention of individual rights or of freedom, and even the communists don't go that far. They at least will pay lip service that we're going to liberate you or something. These people all have, that I've talked about, all have visions of the outcomes that they would like to have happen, and they might not happen if there's freedom, if there's too much freedom. And so to varying degrees, they have these ideas of restricting things. I don't think any of them can achieve what they want, but I think they can sure make a mess of things. And I think that we should not let them do it. So, that's the end, I think.